Hello, everybody. This is John Shutsky from the University of Wisconsin in Madison in the College of Agricultural and Life Sciences. I'm a professor at UW-Madison, also with Extension. I direct the Center for Agricultural Safety and Health at UW and been doing work in this area. I'm going to actually be talking about stress today as part of a series. And we're actually going to do a number of these little modules on the different components of kind of the notion of fighting through the fog of stress. In this particular series is on the basis of where we're at right now with the coronavirus pandemic. And I just want to give you some practical things. We'll try to keep this short and concise, but then we'll kind of expand this with some further modules as we go down the line over time here. First of all, let me just say farm stress, it's no secret. There have been program activities happening around the country for the last several years. I actually been doing intense activity nationwide and here in the state of Wisconsin now since the latter part of 2016, but my work and programming actually goes back, believe it or not, to the droughts in the Midwest in 1988. So I've had a lot of experience, and then a lot of experience also just from having been part of a family that went through some really difficult times back in the 1980s. We deal with a number of stressors on the farm. That includes the financial situation, which obviously I don't need to spend time talking about the details, whether our family situation, we may be working with younger generation or older generation. We have a lot of labor issues right now in agriculture, and these are exacerbated by the virus and by the pandemic and a lot of uncertainty. And then our own personal health. We know that farmers as a general rule are more healthy than the general population, but they're older than the general population as well. And sometimes for people who have health conditions or have difficulty accessing the appropriate level of healthcare, that can be stressful. Lots of outcomes. The impact on health. We know that stress negatively affects potentially heart health, blood pressure, the exacerbation or even the onset of type 2 diabetes, routine seasonal infections. The more we're stressed out, the more we're susceptible to colds and influenza and other types of things, which when our body's immune system is suppressed because of stress, we become somewhat more vulnerable. And we all know about the potential for either increased incidence of depression, anxiety, or if you are a person who has experienced these in the past, definitely as a compounding factor. Relationships, communication can go south, and we can have difficulties during times of high levels of stress. We also know that stress and fatigue is a big contributing factor for injury, non-fatal and fatal farming injuries. Agriculture, the production agriculture industry is the country's most dangerous occupation, and stress almost certainly plays a factor. We've also spent a lot of time in this country talking about suicide and the additional increased risk. The farming community and farmers as an occupational health group, or as an occupational group from the health community's data is in that top tier of the most, the industry that's at the highest risk for suicide. So I want to emphasize a couple things. Stress is not just in our heads. It is something that is real. It is caused by the impacts of stress hormones. In my normal presentations that I've done around the country with Farm Bureau and the Farmers Union at the state and national level and the FSA and lots of different groups, we spend a lot of time talking about this chronic stress cycle. It is a cycle that is fueled by real fuel. In this particular case, hormones, adrenaline, cortisol. And what happens is over a period of time with chronic stress that's coming at us on a daily basis over a course of weeks or months or even years or decades, it really does hamper our body's ability to manage these stress chemicals. And this has an obvious impact on our brain. We've all felt that fog of stress. When things are not going well, we have difficulties making decisions. We have difficulties accessing the frontal part of our brain. It's called the prefrontal cortex or the frontal lobe of the brain. And that's the part of the brain that's really crucial for making decisions, for thinking through different scenarios, sitting down and considering different types of production or financial alternatives. And if we're not making good decisions, then that ends up having consequences. And sometimes those consequences are quite negative if we've made a bad decision, and that only serves to further fuel this vicious cycle. And that's when we really begin to worry about people checking out, getting hurt, in some cases, men and women, but men more so, say like, I just got to like bury my head in my work even harder. And again, that further exacerbates the cycle. And it also increases your probability of having a really negative health outcome, or being injured while you're working on the farm. So a lot of the work that I've been doing is focused on, if you go back to that vicious cycle, how do you break it? How do you find the fuel throttle? It's not always intuitively obvious. I did this article a couple of years ago in one of our local ag magazines talking about where's the throttle. When I was a little kid with my dad's John Deere 4020, it always confused me. I knew how to drive a car when I was quite little, actually, but I never quite understood the concept of a throttle until I got to be probably, I was probably way too young at that time to be operating a tractor. But you need to know where the throttle is. You need to know where the throttles are. It's actually more than one solution. We're talking about multiple throttles. Right here today, we're just going to talk a little bit about the importance of control. If you think about the things that are the very most stressful to us and that result in this notion of chronic stress, it tends to be those things that we have the least amount of control over. And yet there are some things that we need to be able to focus our control and our energy on to help us break that chronic cycle. And then there are other things beyond our control that we need to say, they're variables that we need to consider as we're doing our planning and our other activities, but they're things we simply can't control. I'm not going to spend time here today talking about these, but activity, exercise, getting a sense of perspective. I know a lot of you say, like, I get plenty of exercise. I'm working my butt off. And yet that's not necessarily the type of quiet alone, or maybe going for a walk with a family member. Again, we'll talk about that later. Exercise and being outdoors and those kinds of activities actually do help to provide you with a better sense of perspective. Later, we'll talk about food as a positive fuel. Food and nutrition is really critical. Finding that quiet time for purposeful reflection. I'm actually taping this here in the spring. And so this isn't really quite applicable, but when I talk to farmers about how they manage their stress, one of the things that always comes up is November deer hunting season. And a big part of that is sitting up in a tree stand or being out in the woods where it's quiet and you've got that time for purposeful reflection. And then finally, again, we'll do a little bit on each of these here in the coming days, but another one is obviously sleep. So control is just, I can't overemphasize it enough. There have been decades worth of studies that have been done with lab animals, including rats and monkeys. And what they find is that the killer, the thing that really does take away our joy for life, or really exacerbates this chronic stress response, is not having control. And I could go through lots of examples where they've actually done experimental work with animals and they've really tested out this notion of control. What is really important, though, is in those experiments with lab animals, they have found that you don't have to have 100% control in order to break that chronic stress cycle. In fact, having 100% control, if you are a farmer, is impossible. And we just need to recognize that. But there are some things we can do through the planning process, through making sure that we actually take specific positive actions and don't get caught in that trap of inaction or procrastination. Again, as I mentioned earlier, one of our tendencies is in these times of extreme chronic stress or duress, we say, like, we just got to work harder. And so we don't take the time to actually sit down, either by ourselves or with other people, whether those are other experts, resources, your accountant, your attorney, your banker, communicating with family members and employees. Instead, we just bury our heads in the work, and that's when worse things happen. So don't get caught in this trap of inaction and say, like, when I finally get some spare time, I will take the time to plan, because guess what? That spare time isn't going to just happen. It's so common, though, for all of us to do this. As I hinted at, don't do it alone. You need to enlist other people. Right now, with where we're at in this COVID situation, it is really difficult to do face-to-face meetings, but it is important to find those ways, whether it's by telephone or video conferencing or other methods, to be able to check in with your financial help, your legal help, your production people, your veterinarian. I sit here, who else? Obviously, you want to make sure you're taking care of your health. So I would say your local family doctor, nurse practitioner, wherever it is that you get your health care from, making sure that you're taking good care of yourself. Let me just wrap up by talking a little bit about a framework that I use. I don't have to use it for doing strategic planning for a whole year or for a whole decade. I actually do this to some extent in my daily life. Some of you have probably heard about the framework of SMART goals, things that are specific, things that are measurable, things that are action-oriented, realistic, and time-specified. So again, I think about this sometimes on Sunday night, where I'll sit down and say, what are my one or two big things that I need to get done this week? I need to be focused. You see at the bottom, time specified, which is kind of a fancy way of saying I'm going to give myself a deadline. So what I would encourage you to do is to grab, it could be a paper plate, it could be a piece of paper, but sit down right now and think about, like, what are those one or two things that I really need to get done here in the coming days or in the next week. Our planning horizon right now for where we're at, and to try to help you to break the cycle, if you can just accomplish, or if you can just plan for one or two accomplishments and then really set your mind in a focused way, it will help you to create more visibility and clarity through that fog. So think about the SMART goal framework. What is something very specific and important that's high priority right now, today, or tomorrow, or over the weekend, or whenever your time frame might be? Something that's important that you got to get done. How am I going to know when it gets done? For me, there's a lot of projects I know when I've got them done. I know, for example, when we worked on our taxes here in the last month or so, when I hit submit, and that tax, whether it gets submitted to my accountant or TurboTax, or however it is I did it, I will know when I got that finished and completed. What am I going to do to get started? So inertia, when we're talking about stress and having a lack of energy and feeling anxious, or I don't want to necessarily say depressed, because that has multiple meanings, but you're just having trouble getting going because of this fog that you feel. Sometimes overcoming that inertia, like what are one or two very specific things that I can do to get myself going? Coming back and revisiting it. If this is on your paper plate, put it up on your refrigerator with a magnet. Come back and check on that every night before you go to bed, and just say, how am I doing? Am I making progress? You might need to make some adjustments. You might need to even change your deadline, but make sure that you know specifically when you're going to try to get it done, a day and a time to shoot toward. And again, it's so common that we miss a deadline, we give up, we get frustrated with ourselves, we kick ourselves. If you miss a deadline, get right back on the plate, get right back on that piece of paper, get right back on the horse, and kind of like maybe recalibrate a little bit and move yourself forward on those goals. Anyway, to learn more, we've got a lot of resources. I've done this work with our group of people called it's a team. We've got a website called Resilient Farms, Families, Businesses, and Communities Responding to Stress. And you can see we're organized around 4 areas. Some of these things about how the chronic stress cycle happens, the throttles, stress management, including the things that I'll talk about in the series, communication, really crucial, and then last but not least, your farm future. So a lot of information here on finances, planning, financial, some of the tools for looking at what some alternatives might be for the future in terms of financial management, production management. And we really think that taking control is a key part of that. So again, check back with us often. We'll continue with this series, and we'll look at some of these other practices to help you manage farm stress. Take care.